Hi, I'm Phil Pritchard from Memories of Thorpe Park, and I'm here to talk about the history of X No Way Out and X. So X:/No Way Out operated from 1996 to 2012, and X operated from 2013 to 2017. Thorpe Park's first ever roller coaster was Space Station Zero, which was an indoor space-themed roller coaster that opened in 1984. In 1990, it was moved outdoors and became the Flying Fish. So from when the park opened in 1979 through to 1995, the park only ever really had one roller coaster, which was Space Station Zero and then the Flying Fish. So the area where the X ride was built, when the park first opened, was just a big grassy mound called Mount Olympus. And in the early 80s, they put some go-karts up there. And for most of the 80s, it was home to the Bronco bikes. And then in 1990, a drive in the country opened. This ride was later moved to Ranger County and became Miss Hippo's Fungal Safari. So X No Way Out was known by the project name of Project X. It had a budget of over £4 million, and at the time it was the biggest ride that had ever been built at Thorpe Park, and it was the last major investment by the park's original owners, RMC. The ride was the world's first backwards roller coaster, which basically just meant that it ran backwards in the dark. The project was 4 years in the planning, and the park had aimed it at 10 to 15-year-olds to try and combat Chessington and the newly opened Legoland Windsor. The theme was a loose computer virus theme, and the name was inspired by the old DOS computer commands. So the ride took almost 2 years to construct, and it included having to remove a lot of Mount Olympus. In some places they had to excavate up to 3 meters of soil. During the land clearance part of the project, they decided to rotate the ride building 180 degrees. So originally the entrance to the ride would have been at the back of the park, but they decided that it would look much nicer if the entrance to the ride faced you as you entered the park from the dome. So the first time a lot of guests would have found out that something different was coming to the park was in the 1995 park map, where it was listed as Project X, a top secret development that was being kept under wraps until 96. Not only was the ride very different for the park back then, but so was the advertising. In the early 90s, a lot of the park adverts were bright, colourful, animated TV ads that kind of appealed to the whole family, and also featured the park's mascots, the Thorpe Park Rangers. But this was the advert for X No Way Out. More than £1 million was spent on advertising the ride, with the TV ad costing £200,000. It was directed by Ian Sharp, who was a second unit director on big Hollywood films such as Who Framed Roger Rabbit and the James Bond film GoldenEye. So the original queue line for the ride when it first opened stretched further into the ride building than it did, or it still does now, and it included lots of themed elements and specially themed rooms. This is a clip from an old promo video.
The the minute you enter the pyramid, you'll start to experience a pre-ride adventure, which enhances the anticipation of fear, creates interest and tension while queuing. The first encounter is the security checkpoint and a series of laser bays.
Proceed to decontamination zone.
Having come through that, you will then enter the decontamination area. And then pass onto the vortex, which creates a feeling of disorientation. Then turn a corner and you enter the inverted room. Take on the challenge of the industrial grinders. Having survived all that, you'll then encounter the weird happenings in the metamorphosing chamber. Then you enter the final stage, the ride itself. At the loading bay, you'll be secured into your seat, ready for the ride of a lifetime.
One of the most memorable parts of the original queue line was the metamorphosing chamber, where they had humanoid figures moulded as if they were coming out the wall. They stretched a thin membrane across them and drew the air out from behind using a vacuum, so it actually looked as if the figures were coming out of the wall. This room was also very brightly lit with UV light, so as guests walked through, all their teeth glowed bright green. Another part that isn't mentioned in the video is just before you got onto the ride platform, there were two small lifts that you'd be batched into in small groups. Using a vibrating floor and light and sound effects, they made it feel as if you were actually moving up to the ride platform. The doors would then open, you'd be met with an empty station, and then an empty train would move around the corner. After a few years of operating, the extended queue line, internal queue line, was closed, and since 2002 it's been used for a number of the Fright Night scare mazes, including Freak Show 3D, Hellgate, The Passing, The Cabin in the Woods, and The Living Nightmare. So the ride itself was manufactured by Vekoma. It's an Enigma model coaster, and the Enigma concept was something that Vekoma were trying to sell to many parks, and it included using an indoor roller coaster with part of a fun house. When the ride first opened, it operated in near pitch black darkness, and the only light that you would see riding it was from the on-ride camera photo flash. Another novel thing about the ride at the time is it had onboard audio. So the cars that you were sat in had 3 stereo speakers which played out the industrial sci-fi soundscape that was designed for the ride. Throughout the ride, it had 3 animated block break sections, which further added to the confusion of the ride by using wind, mist, and light and sound effects. On the left, we have a photo of the original on-ride photo area, and on the right is one of the most iconic bits of theming that was still in the ride for quite some time. It was a large oversized battery that was labelled as the Thorpe Park power supply, and this used to light up and arc up with electric as guests walked past. When the ride first opened, there was actually a small retail unit just after you got off the ride, but due to the particular fire regulations for the building, they weren't actually able to sell or stock too many combustible products, so the store was removed, but the park did sell quite a few X-themed items over the years. In 2007, the ride received its biggest update since it opened. The remaining queue line was repainted and had new lighting, and they tried to further reinforced the storyline of the ride, and they created a new story based around the X Laboratories facility, and there was a new Q-line video to try and further enforce the story. During 2010, the park trialled a lights-on trial to try and cut down the amount of downtime the ride had due to guests getting motion sickness from travelling backwards in the dark. And then in 2013, after 17 seasons as X:/No Way Out, it was rethemed as X. The ride was now forward-facing and featured lots of bright lights, lasers and club music, and guests were invited to ride on a wave of light and sound. In the first year it reopened as X, it had its own specially created hour-long dance music soundtrack. That was then replaced over the next few years with generic, recent and classic chart dance songs. And then last year it received a new soundtrack from Imascore, which was a remix of the island theme. This was a nice bit as you came off the ride when it was X, throwing back to the original X:/No Way Out. As you can see, the ride received quite a few changes over the years, but the biggest change that it's ever had has happened this year, where it's now reopening as The Walking Dead The Ride. Thank you for listening to that talk. I hope you found it interesting. I'll be around if you've got any questions or you'd like to talk about any other classic Thorpe Park attractions.
Ladies and gentlemen, give Phil Pritchard a massive round of applause! Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to the wonderful Mr. Phil Pritchard. Let's give him a massive round of applause once again.